Today's Bible reading is from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 45.
I'm so sorry, Brian, but
Quite all right. Settle down. Okay. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "The sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And then he said to the disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you were going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in daytime will not stumble, for they see the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had begun speaking of his death, but the disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whomever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," and she said, "He is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been in there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When Lazarus had said this, when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave cloths and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. And this is the word of the Lord. Please be seated.
Good morning. Brian is never going to want to be my liturgist again. I warned him. I told him at Ad Council it's a long reading, and he said, "Oh, that's okay." And then I handed him the reading, and he went, 1 through 45. I said, "You have to tell the whole story, Brian."
It was a good story. I'm glad we read the whole thing.
Where have you been? That's the title of my sermon. Where have you been? That's what I asked my mom's priest as I stood by her bed, the bed hospice brought in. We had flown to Florida, having such difficulty getting a flight because there were snowstorms, and I knew my mom had taken a turn for the worse. So when I got there, I asked my sister, "Where's the priest?" And she said, "Well, I called him, but..." I said, "But what?" My mother had been a very faithful woman all her life and was active in the church. "Where have you been?" I didn't expect a miracle. I didn't expect, like Jesus, to come and raise her or heal her. But I wanted her to have holy unction. And when the priest came, I was more like Martha. I didn't run out to greet him. I was a little sullen, sitting down by the bed. It made me think, can you imagine how frustrated Mary and Martha were? They knew that Jesus loved Lazarus, and they sent him word. But in fairness, they didn't say, "Our brother is dying." They said, "He who you love has fallen ill." Or some readings say, "Your dear friend is very sick." But Jesus said to the disciples, "It's okay, it's not like he's gonna die," basically. And they're like, "Okay." And Jesus was less than 2 miles away from Bethany. Less than 2 miles. Can you imagine? Martha, who was the one in the story before where Jesus came to preach, Martha was the one who was cooking and cleaning and was like, "Jesus, could you get Mary to give me a hand here?" And Jesus said, "No, Mary's doing the right thing. She's listening." So I figure Martha was running around, cleaning, making sure there was plenty of food, waiting for Jesus and the disciples to come through the door any minute. But she waited, and she waited. And what was our Jesus doing? Our Jesus was there with the disciples. Jesus tells them he is fallen asleep. He's fallen asleep for the glory of God. So when he finally decides that they should go to Bethany, the disciples say, basically, "Are you crazy? The last time we were in that area, the people wanted to stone you. Why do you want to go back to Judea? And Jesus says, because Lazarus has fallen asleep. Sounds like what a sick person should be doing, resting, sleeping. But Jesus uses metaphors all the time. And I think at this point in time, he decided enough with the metaphors and says, he's dead. Lazarus is dead. For some reason, which as many times as I read it, I didn't quite get it, but Thomas says, well, let's go and die with him, meaning die with Jesus. Confusing. But there was a time coming, and we know there was a time coming. But Lazarus went anyway. I'm doing what you did. But Jesus went anyway. Lazarus had been dead 4 days. Now they used these ointments and the perfumes for a body, but after 4 days, the perfumes were doing nothing. So when Jesus does come, Martha runs and says, if only you had been here. A little bit of guilt there. If only you had been here. Then, after he comforts her, he says, go ask for Mary. Tell Mary I want to see her. Mary goes out, falls at his feet, and says, oh, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Guilt times 2. And I think they were probably a lot nicer than I would have been. Mary had been surrounded by the mourners, people who came from Jerusalem to mourn with her and wail with her. Well, when they see her get up and run out, they figure she's gone to the tomb. So they follow her. But Jesus asks them, where is Lazarus? This is going to sound a tiny bit familiar to you. He was in a tomb, but the tomb was actually a cave, and the cave had a stone in front of it. You may have heard this kind of thing before. Jesus said, roll the stone away. And so Martha and Mary are saying, don't go in there. There are some icons in churches that actually have a picture of the stone being rolled away and the mourners holding their noses, expecting the most awful stench to come out. Of course, Jesus just yells, Lazarus, come out. And he comes out with his grave clothes, all those strips of cloth around his whole body. And Jesus is telling them, okay, take those grave clothes off him. They were not white and shiny and neatly folded and left in the tomb. He came out with them on because someday he was going to be using them again. But not today. Not today. Jesus, when he did call him out, looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me, but I'm saying this for the people here so that they will believe. They will believe in me. And of course, some did. They were like, wow. And then there were some just like the people we have today. Well, really, if he was all that, and if he healed the blind man, why wasn't he here? He could have done this and saved Lazarus from dying. So, we know this story. It's not an unfamiliar story. In fact, if you say to people, "What is your favorite verse in the Bible?" people will go, "Jesus wept." You know why? Because it's the shortest verse in the Bible. So everybody knows it. And if I'm completely honest with you, I looked at the lectionary today and said, oh, I don't want to do Lazarus. Everybody knows the ending. Everybody knows what happened. So I went back and I was reading through the Gospel of John, and I realized that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're all about parables. Parables, but not John. John is about what Jesus did with miracles, but also how Jesus interacted with people. That really struck me. I don't know why I've never noticed it before, but I looked and I said, what's the takeaway? What do I want people to go home thinking about? And I looked at the different stories, when Jesus changes water into wine. It's one of my favorites, actually. Good wine. But he does that because he cares about the people and because his mother asked him to do something. But he cared about the people. That was what we saw. He cared about people who had fallen astray. He cared about people who were having a great time. He cared about children. And I look at that water into wine, and that is Jesus used people to show his caring. And then that was in Cana. And then also in Cana, there was an official. It doesn't say a Roman official, but more than likely a Roman official. His son was sick. He walked 20 miles to go to Jesus and ask him to heal his son. And Jesus told him, go home. Your son's going to be okay. I walked 20 miles and you're telling me to just go back home. But that's what he did. He believed Jesus. And he walked back home. And as he was walking back home, his servants came and said, Master, your son is healed. And he asked, when did it happen? It was 1 o'clock. And that official realized it was at 1 o'clock that Jesus told him, your son is okay, go home. That says to me, we always say seeing is believing, but not in that case. Believing was seeing. He believed and just turned around and went home. And we know Jesus walked on water. The thought of Jesus walking on the water and the guys in the boats and it's big storms and it's lightning. We know Peter stepped out of the boat, looked at Jesus, and then went down like a rock when he stopped looking at Jesus. He lost sight of Jesus. We sometimes lose sight of Jesus. We need to keep our eye focused. We know that Jesus took those couple of little barley loaves and a few fish and fed, it says 5,000, but that's 5,000 men. Women and children weren't counted. The message there, we have a hunger. How many times do you know of people who have that hole that needs to be filled within them? Jesus is the bread of life. He fills that hunger. If you focus on Jesus, if you really think how your life should be, that hunger is filled. And then, of course, we have the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. The Jews hated the Samaritans. They were half-breeds. They wouldn't even talk to Samaritans. They used to go way around when they were going someplace, not to go through Samaria. But our Jesus, he not only spoke to this woman, he not only treated her like she was special, he filled her. And he said he was the water, the living water. That blind man that Jesus healed, he opened his eyes. He opened his eyes and he made him see. We need to have our eyes open. We need to think about forgiveness. We know Jesus saved the woman who was going to be stoned because she had been an adulteress. How many times do we judge? That's not what we're supposed to do. It is so incredibly basic when you look at what we're to do, how we're to love one another, how we're to care for one another, how we're to lift one another. I look at this congregation and I can tell you I have never come into this church at a time that I wasn't lifted, that I wasn't having a hard time and someone gave me a hug or someone put their hand on my shoulder and said either, "How are you feeling?" or "How is your granddaughter doing?" or "How is Chip?" Lifted. It's what we're supposed to do. Keep our eye on Jesus. It's what we're supposed to do. Love each other. And John, the Gospel of John, gives all of these things. And lastly, of course, Lazarus. Talk about a metaphor. How many times do we feel dead? How many times in our lives have we been so low? But Jesus tells us, come out, come out. Lift your eyes, open your heart, reach out. We are lifted because we have the loving Savior, Jesus Christ. May we never forget that. Even when we take our eye off Jesus briefly, let us focus on what's important in life. You can look at the news and you can see terrible things and hear terrible things, but there is so much good. There are so many Christians out there trying to do so many good things. Let us keep focused. Let us keep our eyes on Jesus. Like the song said, let us trust and obey. Amen.